New problems for AWB over its wheat dealings with Saddam Hussein's regime. A boatload of West Papuan asylum seekers found off northern Australia. Foreign militants reported among the victims of a US bombing raid in
asylum
Pakistan.
Seekers have made it to the Australian mainland. More than 40 boat people fled the Indonesian province of Papua. It's believed they departed the region last Friday. In fact, I don't believe that the Indonesian province is Papua. I think that's Irian Jaya. Coastwatch found their boat at about 2 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time on Cape York. It's only the third boat to hit the mainland in 5 years.
Bad weather has forced NASA to postpone mankind's first mission to Pluto.
Its takeover bid for Patrick Corp. Patrick Corp shares up about 2.3%, Jacinta, but we do have Toll shares down 4.5%. The All Ords is currently up 40 points, or just under 0.9%, so it looks like we will have a very strong end to the afternoon.
And Jackie, more evidence that Australians are saying no to debt.
Jacinta, yes, we've had personal lending data out today, and we've seen a 17th straight month of declines in personal lending in annual terms across the month of November. Now, that's an extended decline. In fact, it's unprecedented, and we haven't seen such an extended decline in personal lending figures ever, including the recession in the early 1990s, where interest rates were up at 18%. So it's clear that more Australians are shunning debt, paying back existing debts, and that's also clear because the only rise we saw across the figures was in loans to consolidate existing debt.
And those were Indonesia for up to 180,000 deaths in East Timor during its 24-year occupation. The leaked findings from the Reception, Truth and Reconciliation Commission show the military poisoned the food and water supply. Australia has also been criticised for recognising Indonesia's occupation. Only a small number of Indonesian officials have ever been punished for their involvement, but East Timor says it will take no further action. And 43 asylum seekers are undergoing health checks after their boat reached far north Queensland from the Indonesian province of West Papua. The 36 adults and 7 children are believed to have been moved to an Air Force base. The government says the men will be put in detention, but the women and children will not.
We can make appropriate accommodation for the women and children.
Their boat carried political banners claiming West Papuans are being persecuted by the Indonesian government. To Finance News now, the share market.
For would-be refugees from West Papua. Indonesia accused of deliberately starving tens of thousands of East Timorese. Another torrid day for AWB's chief at the Iraq wheat inquiry, and an emotional return for survivors of the Egyptian bus crash. Good evening, Mary Kostakidis with SBS World News Australia. The Immigration Minister, Amanda Vanstone, has signalled that there will be no special treatment for a boatload of West Papuans believed to be seeking refuge in Australia. The 43 people, including 7 children, have been placed in isolation tonight in Weipa, 26 hours after coming ashore on Queensland's Cape York Peninsula.
The first images of the 43 West Papuan men, women and children on Australian soil. Their outrigger carried them for 5 days across the Torres Strait and bore their message, save West Papua people's soul from genocide. A Coastwatch helicopter spotted them north of Weipa on the Cape York Peninsula. All 43 were then whisked to this RAAF base for processing and isolated for what the government says are health precautions.
They're very quiet. All their immediate needs are being met, as in food, that sort of stuff, clothing. Like I said, they've got the occupational nurse there at the moment looking at them.
Independence advocates in Australia are urging the government to release the detainees into the care of the community and for them to be granted refugee status. Immigration Minister Amanda Vanstone says they won't be given special treatment.
Well, look, we've always handled refugee claims on their merit individually. We've never listened to individual lobby groups about what ought to be done or what people who through the media say we will do.
Human rights groups are also calling for the detainees to remain on the mainland.
Dimia are obviously scrabbling to decide what to do next. Our concern is that they will take them offshore to Christmas Island.
Activists within Papua say they had little choice but to flee because of the crackdown by the Indonesian government on protesters calling for autonomy.
Many of us want to run away to Papua New Guinea, but but Papua New Guinea, they can do nothing. You know, we went to Papua New Guinea, but not safety for us in Papua New Guinea because Indonesia is there, and maybe we're looking for Australian is more safety place than Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, because Indonesia is there.
But Indonesia's foreign ministry says it will listen to what the detainees have to say. Leroy Arben, World News Australia.
And we're joined on the line now by the man who took those photos of the West Papuans, Damien Baker of Torres News. Damien, the Papuans had just endured a long and treacherous journey. How did they look when you saw them?
Yes, Mary, we were probably 50 metres away at most times, but from the distance that we could see them, they looked in good condition. Considering they'd been 5 days at sea in a traditional wooden canoe, they looked quite healthy and quite relaxed, really.
How did the authorities react when you approached?
We did a couple of passes in the helicopter before we landed. After we landed, we got out of the chopper and basically we were confronted almost immediately by the police. I tried to run down the beach to take photos and was confronted by the third officer, while my editor, Corey Boson, spoke to the first two. It was pretty obvious they didn't want any photographs, and there was plenty of effort put in with jumpers and waving arms not to allow them to be taken for quite some time.
Damien, they've been described as dissident students. Is that an accurate description? What do you know of them?
Look, Mary, we've been in touch, or we've been in fairly close contact with the Australian West Papuan Association in Melbourne. We've talking to a guy down there called Jacob Rumbiak. He's informed us. Jacob himself, first of all, is an activist for many years. He's actually spent 10 years in Indonesian prisons himself. Partially, the people who are on this boat, mostly students, I believe, if not all students. Some of them were actually Mr. Rumbiak's students. They're all at risk in his understanding from the Indonesian government. One in particular, Mr. Herman Wanganai, I think they pronounce the name, has spent a year and a half in Indonesian jails before getting here. And in fact, his father, was, he died in prison while serving time with Janana Guzlam years ago.
Thank you, Damien. Damien Baker there from the Torres News. A leaked copy of the United Nations...
Liam Fox, ABC News, Brisbane.
The Immigration Minister says a group of Papuan asylum seekers found on Cape York will be treated the same as others who arrive by boat. Refugee advocates say most of the 43 on board are leaders in the West Papua independence movement and could be killed if sent home.
30 men, 6 women and 7 children spent the day under police guard, undergoing health checks. They're yet to be processed by immigration officials. The group made the dangerous 5-day journey from the Indonesian province of Papua in this traditional outrigger with only one engine. The boat carried a large banner calling for an end to genocide in the province and freedom from Indonesian military rule.
These are people who are clear members of an independence movement. They are people who are fleeing persecution, and they are people who should be treated with dignity and respect.
The patron of Australia's West Papuan Association says Indonesia's oppression in the province is nearly identical to the problems in East Timor.
The extraordinary abuses of human rights through murder, massacre, rape and imprisonment and all the rest of it, that just keeps on building up.
The International Council of Jurists says the 43 should be treated differently from other boat arrivals because they came straight from where they were being persecuted.
They must be treated like lawfully under the Refugee Convention, like refugees, not put in some offshore island while they're processed.
The Immigration Minister says while family groups are likely to stay in the community, single men will probably be sent into detention. The arrival also creates a diplomatic headache for Australia as it tries to maintain cordial relations with Indonesia. But Amanda Vanstone says she's not worried about any political pressure.
I have no communication from the Indonesian government other than advice that a consular official will make themselves available.
And she says the arrival doesn't suggest Australia's border security failed.
A very, very difficult boat to spot because it's a traditional vessel used in those areas quite frequently.
It It's not known where the group will be taken or when. David Curnow, ABC News.
More survivors of the Egypt bus crash are home.
Revenge attack. Refugee activists claim a relative of one of the Papuans who fled to Australia is among 4 people killed by the Indonesian army. Standing down, the Defence Minister resigns. What does it mean for Peter Costello's leadership ambitions? The US rejects a truce offer from Osama bin Laden. And fresh evidence of global warming in the Antarctic. Hello and welcome. I'm Rita Chima with SBS World News Australia. A 14-year-old boy said to be a relative of one of the Papuan asylum seekers who landed in Australia earlier this week has been shot and killed by Indonesian soldiers. 2 local pastors in Papua and activists here in Australia have told SBS the soldiers opened fire on a group of people, killing at least 4. But an Indonesian police spokesman says only 1 person has been killed. This comes amid a row over how the group of 43 asylum seekers have been treated since they arrived in Australia.
Free West Papua, let them stay.
Refugee activists in Sydney appealing to the federal government for mercy.
We should learn the lesson of East Timor. These people face the persecution. The same military commanders, the same militias that were present in East Timor are now building and growing in West Papua.
But reports tonight that there is little mercy in Papua. Civilians from the same area as the asylum seekers have been gunned down by the Indonesian military, according to 2 local pastors. Australian activist Nick Chesterfield says one of those killed, a 14-year-old boy, was a relative of one of the asylum seekers. His group gave the federal government the names of all the boat people, and he fears that information has been passed on to the Indonesians.
This shows that something very, very terrible has happened with sharing of information. The Australian government has got blood on its hands right now because we provided a list of names in confidence to the Australian government for the purposes of verification. Now, they absolutely assured us that this would not be shared in any way with the Indonesians because they knew full well what the ramifications were.
When it arrived in Australia, the asylum seekers' boat bore the message, "Save West Papua people from genocide." Campaigners had hoped the government would process their claims on the mainland, but the 43 are now on Christmas Island. The Prime Minister has defended moving the group offshore.
That's entirely appropriate, and their position will be assessed, they'll be interviewed, and they will be dealt with in accordance with the law.
But Labor has criticised the transfer.
Health, identity, security. They're the reasons for detention to take place. Once those checks are complete, there will be no reason for people to not be allowed to be back within the Australian community while it's being determined whether or not they're genuine refugees.
There's yet to be an official comment from Jakarta on the shooting, but Indonesia's Foreign Affairs Ministry earlier warned that if Australia grants asylum, relations between the 2 countries may be disturbed. Brian Thompson, World News Australia.
The federal government says it has asked Indonesia to investigate reports that up to 4 people were shot dead by the Indonesian military in West Papua. The opposition and the Greens want an investigation into whether the shooting was linked to the arrival of a group of asylum seekers in Australia this week.
According to human rights activists, one of those killed was a close relative of an asylum seeker who arrived on Cape York Peninsula this week. It's raised concerns that the shooting was an act of retaliation, but there are conflicting reports of what happened in their home village. Activists say up to 4 people were killed, including a 14-year-old boy, after violence erupted in a marketplace. But an Indonesian police spokesman says only 1 person was killed and 2 injured. The opposition has called on the federal government to investigate exactly what happened.
The relationship with Indonesia, of course, is very important, but we will never be silenced on human rights concerns.
The Attorney-General, Philip Ruddock, says Australia has asked for urgent clarification, but the government won't be pressing Indonesia further.
At the end of the day, those matters have to be dealt with in accordance with Indonesian law and practice, and hopefully with a proper regard to human rights issues.
The Indonesian embassy says it's investigating, but believes the incident was criminal, not political, and it is not linked to the asylum seekers. The Greens want the government to stall negotiations with Indonesia over a security treaty, with a high-level delegation due to arrive in Canberra this week.
And we are calling on the Australian government to ensure that they do not sign on to any security treaty that means that they cannot comment when these sorts of human rights abuses occur.
Human rights activists say there are also reports that Indonesian military intelligence officers have visited a local pastor with a list of names of the asylum seekers who arrived in Australia this week. But the federal government has rejected claims that Australia allowed Indonesian officials access to the asylum seekers, saying it's not government practice. Cassandra Hill, World News Australia.
Believed to have rushed a battalion of troops in to quell an uprising in a West Papuan town where at least 4 teenagers were shot yesterday. Contrary to initial reports, it appears only one of those shot has been killed. It's now believed the shootings are not linked to this week's arrival of 43 asylum seekers in Australia. However, there are new reports that other relatives of the asylum seekers have been targeted by Indonesian intelligence.
2 days after 43 asylum seekers arrived from West Papua, there were reports Indonesian soldiers had exacted revenge. There were claims the Indonesian army, the TNI, had opened fire on youths in the same area where many of the asylum seekers come from. Now, a clearer picture is emerging. Those in the region say at least one teenage boy was killed by TNI troops in Wagete, but the shooting is believed to be linked to a previous dispute. The town is on edge, with reports hundreds have gathered to keep the TNI out.
I don't see any connections with the arrival of the 43 asylum seekers in Australia. Last night it was quite tense. We're hoping that there won't be any continued clashes.
Tonight, there are reports a TNI battalion has been rushed from Tamika, near the Papuan coast, to the Wagete region. And there are other allegations that relatives of the asylum seekers, now in detention on Christmas Island, have been questioned by Indonesian intelligence officers. In one case, a family member may have been murdered.
We don't have a capacity to investigate issues. They're matters for the Indonesian government to do so properly in accordance with Indonesian law.
All of this as Jakarta faces a grim catalogue of its legacy of violence in another troubled region, East Timor. That country's government has officially handed the UN its report into Indonesia's 24-year occupation, with Indonesia blamed for at least 100,000 deaths.
To heal the wounds in the people's minds, we need this.
Indonesian officials say they will examine the report, but as far as they're concerned, it's time to move on. Norman Hermont, ABC News, Sydney.